Okay, in this podcast, we're going to talk about making series of images. And all the other assignments we've done, you've turned in more than one image per assignment, but we've never discussed the ideas about how those images relate to each other. And photography is obviously a really easy medium to use to make groups of images. And of course, with the first example that I'm showing you, I'm doing that to illustrate the fact that we're really accustomed to dealing with groups of images, and usually in a serial form, that you're creating some kind of narrative. Every TV show you've watched, every movie you've watched, those of you that are into graphic novels, comic books, all these things are series of images. And that's the way that most people are accustomed to consuming series of images, is in a narrative fashion. And so I'm going to show you a couple of examples here first of images used in narrative form, but then I'm going to show you some other images, and so we can discuss how images communicate in different ways. Okay, so this first set of photographic images I'm showing you are by the photographer Duane Michals. And Duane Michals really has utilized this idea of narrative groups of images in his work most of his career, and does a lot of very clever arrangements with them. So as I'm talking, as you're watching these images scroll by, one of the points that I really want to make with it is that the order in which you view these images is extremely important. There are other visual similarities to them. You can look through them and see some kind of visual similarities that make them work together as a group. But the main thing is that the order of those images is really crucial to you understanding the point that he wants to make. So there's really two basic things going on with a group of images like this. One is obviously the narrative that you see, that's sort of delivered to you through the subject matter in the images. The bathroom fixtures, the picture that you see at the beginning and end. But another thing that's going on is just the visual similarities between these images. And I can name a few right off the bat. For instance, notice that all 9 pictures are oriented horizontally. All 9 pictures are black and white. They all have a similar tonal range to them. So even though you may not be thinking about those kinds of similarities overtly, they're also important kind of glue to viewing these as a body of work rather than 9 individual images. So I'm showing you the very first image again to make a point that even though this image is, this group of images is in a grid, the order in which you look at them is very important, and we've kind of been trained in Western culture to read them left to right and top to bottom. So I go from the upper left corner to the bottom right corner in order to view them. And of course I could try looking at them in a different order, but they really don't make any sense. That the order in which you view them is crucial to the narrative that is being told. But then I'm going to show you another group of images in a grid by it's actually a husband and wife team, Anna and Bernhard Blum, German artists who do a lot of work in series. And this is a group of 9 images in a grid. But I see this as being fundamentally different from the other narrative group of images, or even the Duane Michals group, in that this set of 9 images is really purposely made to be viewed in basically any way possible. You can read it left to right, you can read it top to bottom, you can read it diagonally, and they are purposely creating images and arranging them in a way so that you confront them and look at them in terms of their visual relationships to each other. there is no narrative to speak of. There you might be able to find some very vague kind of narrative, but they're really meant to be images that you look at and, in a sense, play with in terms of their visual relationships to each other. So more specifically, look at the image in the upper left corner, and Mr. Bloom has placed himself in that upper left corner, so it's weighted to the upper left, and then you go diagonally to the bottom right and notice that he's placed in the bottom right corner. Or notice that the three images in the middle, if you're looking at them vertically, all have a very strong central axis to them. So the way they've arranged these images is to emphasize the visual relationships that you see between, the image next to it, and also just as a whole composition. So here's another image by the Blooms, and notice that it's obviously has very strong visual relationships from one image to the next, and perhaps you could even view it as one large image rather than three separate ones. But also look at the kind of consistencies in this image, like I mentioned with the Duane Michaels series, that they're all black and white, they're all vertical, they're all the same proportion. So they really have very strong kind of glue that makes you look at these as a body of work. Okay, now next I'm going to show you a group of images by the artist Ruth Thorne Thompson. And I think with the Bloom images it's easy to see them as a group just because they are purposely constructing them in a way that they're close to each other, that you see them as groups of images. Ruth Thorne Thompson's images are not meant to be seen in a grid or in a close line like this, but they nonetheless have very obvious visual similarities to them, and this is the really strong point that I want to make in this presentation, is that I notice with beginning photographers that when you start dealing with groups, that most people want to think in terms of narrative. And when they start thinking about communicating a narrative, they really stop thinking about how they can make that group of images relate to each other purely in a visual sense. So I've shown you a couple of examples of groups of images and how those visual similarities really hold them together as a group. So let's look through some of these images of Ruth Thorne Thompson's, and you can see, repeating kinds of subject matter, statuary and landscape, and maybe the feeling that they're from some kind of ancient culture, almost like the heads on Easter Island, and kind of strange things happening, a plane floating through the sky, but then a chair floating through the sky, or this human figure that's composed of dots standing on a beach. So there's similarities running through them in terms of their content, but like the other groups that I've shown you, they also have similarities in terms of their purely formal aspects. They're all rectangular. They're all black and white. They were all made using a pinhole camera, so they have kind of a crude feeling to them. They are all sepia toned, which adds to the feeling that they are somehow old documents. So she's very aware of creating individual images that can stand on their own, but also creating a body of work, a series of work that can be seen as a group. And that is really how most mature artists work, is creating bodies of work that relate to each other rather than simply thinking of each image as being totally separate from the last one that they made. So the last group of images that I'm going to be showing you are by the photographer Olivia Parker, and they're a really lovely set of still lifes with many of the same characteristics that I've been pointing out in all the other ones, that you have similarity in content, in the subject matter, the objects, and the feeling of them, but also in terms of those other formal relationships. They're all black and white. They all have a really interesting use of light and shadow Many of them use paper. So for this assignment, this is what I want you to do, is to make a group of images that relate to each other purely on a formal basis. In other words, I do not want you to make a group of images that has a narrative to it. I don't want that to be the driving force behind the group of images. I want it to be how they relate to each other visually. So you check the syllabus and make sure you know exactly how many images I want you to make. But I want that group of images to have enough visual similarity to them that the casual viewer would understand that they relate to each other as a series. If you want to, you can arrange them like the Blooms did. You could put it in a grid if you wanted to, or you can put them in a line like you would see, say, in a gallery or in a book. But I want you to be very deliberate about the order in which we see these images, as well as just the group of images themselves.